I found her frozen alive, my own grandmother, and my mother called it mercy. Those words still burn in my throat like acid, like the kind of truth that scorches everything it touches. You think you know cold? You think you understand what it means to feel your soul freeze over? I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about family, about love, about the thin line between care and cruelty. Before we begin, subscribe, and tell me where in the world are you watching from? Because I need to know that somewhere out there, people still have hearts that beat warm. I need to know that what I'm about to tell you matters to someone, anyone, because it's eating me alive from the inside out. My name is Grace Morgan. I'm 34 years old, and I used to save lives for a living. I was a paramedic for 8 years before I couldn't handle watching people die anymore, before I ran away to Europe like a coward, thinking distance could cure the nightmares. I was wrong. Some nightmares follow you across oceans, and some nightmares are waiting for you when you come home. I hadn't spoken to my family in 5 years. 5 years of silence, of unanswered emails, of birthday cards I never sent. I told myself it was because I needed space, needed to heal, needed to find myself. But the truth? The truth is I was angry. Angry at my mother for always being too busy, too stressed, too overwhelmed to really see me. Angry at my stepfather for stepping into our lives and pretending he belonged. Angry at myself for caring so damn much about people who seem to care so little about each other. But guilt is a powerful thing, isn't it? It creeps up on you in the middle of the night when you're alone in a foreign country, working dead-end jobs just to avoid going home. It whispers in your ear that maybe you're the problem, maybe you're the one who abandoned them first. So I came back. God help me, I came back. The house looked like a corpse when I pulled into the driveway. You know that feeling when you see something that used to be alive, and now it's just hollow? That's what hit me. The porch light flickered like it was having a seizure, casting these sick, strobing shadows across the front steps. The shutters hung at wrong angles, banging against the siding in the wind like bones rattling in a coffin. I sat in my rental car for 20 minutes, just staring at the place where I grew up. The windows were dark, not just dark, but black, like the house was wearing sunglasses to hide its shame. No smoke from the chimney, no warm glow from the living room where Grandma used to sit with her crossword puzzles and her terrible soap operas. Nothing. Just this dead, hollow shell that used to be a home. The silence was the worst part. Houses are supposed to breathe, you know? They're supposed to have this gentle rhythm of life inside them, footsteps, voices, the hum of appliances, the creak of settling wood. This house held its breath like it was afraid to make a sound. I remembered summer evenings when I was 12, 13, running through the sprinklers in the backyard while Grandma called out from the kitchen window, telling me to be careful not to slip. I remembered Christmas mornings when the whole house smelled like cinnamon and coffee, when presents overflowed from under the tree and Grandma would slip me an extra $20 for being such a good girl. I remembered feeling safe here, feeling loved here, feeling like this was where I belonged in the world. Standing on that porch, fumbling with my keys, I felt like I was trying to break into a mausoleum. The front door opened with this long, painful groan, like the house was crying out in agony. The air inside hit me like a slap, not just cold, but wrong. It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there, the kind that makes you understand why people die of broken hearts. And the smell. God, the smell was like dust and disappointment and something else, something that made my stomach turn. I called out, "Hello? Mom? Grandma?" My voice echoed back at me, hollow and pathetic. The silence that followed was so complete it made my ears ring. That's when I found the note. Sitting on the kitchen counter like it was the most normal thing in the world, written in my mother's careful handwriting on the back of a utility bill. Grace took a trip to the coast with David. Don't wake Grandma, she's resting. Back next week. Mom. Don't wake Grandma. Don't wake Grandma. Those words kept repeating in my head like a broken record, and something about them made my paramedic instincts start screaming. You don't tell someone not to wake an elderly person unless something is very, very wrong. I walked through the house like I was walking through a crime scene, noting every detail with the clinical precision I'd learned in the field. The thermostat in the hallway read 58 degrees. 58 degrees. In November. In Massachusetts. The heat was on just enough to keep the pipes from freezing, nothing more. The refrigerator hummed with a sick, mechanical wheeze. Most of the lights were off except for one dim bulb in the kitchen that cast these long, distorted shadows everywhere. And underneath it all, there was this sound, this soft, rhythmic tapping that I couldn't identify, like someone gently knocking on a door that would never open. I followed the sound down the hallway to Grandma's room. The door was closed, and there was a piece of tape across the frame with a note that said, "Do not disturb, recovering." My hands were shaking as I peeled away the tape, and I don't know if it was from the cold or from the terror that was building in my chest like a tumor. I opened the door, and the cold hit me like a physical blow. It was like opening a freezer, like stepping into a morgue. The window was cracked open about an inch, letting in the November air, and there was no heat source in the room at all. None. The radiator was turned off, unplugged, abandoned. And there, in the middle of that Arctic wasteland, was my grandmother. She was buried under a pile of thin blankets that might as well have been tissue paper for all the warmth they provided. Her skin was this awful blue-white color, like milk that had gone bad, and her lips were purple and cracked. Her breath came out in these tiny, desperate puffs of steam, and her whole body was shaking with tremors that made the bed frame rattle. But her eyes... God, her eyes were still alert, still human, still looking at me with this mixture of hope and resignation that nearly brought me to my knees. She tried to smile when she saw me, and it was the most heartbreaking thing I've ever witnessed in my life. "Grace," she whispered, and her voice was like paper tearing. "You came back." I was starting to think love freezes too. I grabbed the thermometer from her nightstand with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely read it. 41 degrees. 41 degrees. That room was 41 degrees, and they had left her there to die slowly, degree by degree, breath by breath. My training kicked in like muscle memory. I ran to the linen closet and grabbed every blanket, every towel, every piece of fabric I could find. I wrapped her up like a cocoon, like I was trying to build a nest of warmth around her fragile body. I cranked the heat in the rest of the house and opened her door wide to let the warm air flow in. I lit every candle I could find and placed them around her room, not for romance but for survival. I boiled water on the stove and brought her steaming mugs to hold, not to drink but to warm her hands. I called her doctor, I called the emergency room, I called everyone I could think of who might be able to help. But more than anything, I held her. I climbed into that freezing bed and wrapped my arms around her tiny, shivering body, and I used my own warmth to keep her alive. We stayed like that for hours, me whispering apologies into her hair while she whispered forgiveness into mine. "I'm so sorry, Grandma. I'm so sorry I left. I'm so sorry I wasn't here. Shub, baby girl. You're here now. That's all that matters." If you've ever had to save the same people who were supposed to protect you, keep watching. Because this story gets so much worse before it gets better. As the hours passed and Grandma's color slowly returned to something resembling human, fragments of the truth started emerging like pieces of a shattered mirror. She told me about the bills that stopped getting paid, about the insurance policies that got adjusted, about the medical appointments that got canceled because they were too expensive. She told me about the heating company that had come to shut off the service 3 months ago, and how my mother had convinced them to leave just the bare minimum to keep the house from freezing. She told me about the meals that got smaller and smaller, about the medications that got forgotten, about the social workers who stopped coming because my mother told them everything was fine. She said I was costing too much, Grandma whispered, and the pain in her voice cut through me like a blade. She said maybe it would be better if I just rested. Permanently. I started going through the papers on my mother's desk, and what I found there made me sick to my stomach. Insurance forms with beneficiary changes. Medical bills marked refused payment. Bank statements showing Grandma's pension being transferred to my mother's account. A printed email from a hospice care facility threatening to close her case due to family interference with end-of-life protocols. But the worst thing, the thing that still keeps me awake at night, was a text message thread between my mother and my stepfather that I found on an old phone in the kitchen drawer. Messages going back months, talking about Grandma like she was a piece of furniture they wanted to get rid of. She's getting worse. Maybe we should just let nature take its course. The heating bill is killing us. What if we just turned it down in her room? She sleeps so much anyway. She probably wouldn't even notice. If we're not actively doing anything, it's not really our fault, right? They didn't kill her fast. They just let winter do it slowly. I sat in that kitchen, reading those messages over and over again, and I felt something inside me break. Not my heart, that had broken years ago. Something deeper. Something that I didn't even know could break. These were the people who had raised me. The people who had taught me about right and wrong, about taking care of family, about love and loyalty and honor. And they had decided, with the casual cruelty of accountants balancing a budget, that my grandmother was a burden too expensive to bear. I called my old partner from the firehouse, Jake Morrison, who had left emergency services around the same time I did and now worked with elder care enforcement. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation, but I could hear it cracking like ice under pressure. "Grace, you need to document everything," he said, and I could hear the controlled anger in his voice. "Take pictures, record statements, preserve evidence. This isn't just neglect, this is systematic abuse with intent to harm." So that's what I did. I became a detective in my own family's crime scene. I photographed the thermostat readings, the condition of her room, the pile of unpaid medical bills. I made copies of the bank statements, the insurance changes, the text messages. I recorded video statements of the house's condition, of Grandma's physical state, of my own observations as a trained medical professional. But the most important evidence came from Grandma herself. When I asked if she would be willing to make a statement about what had been happening to her, she looked at me with these clear, determined eyes and said, "Baby girl, I've been waiting 74 years to tell the truth about something that mattered. Let's do this." We set up my phone camera in her room, and she sat up as straight as her fragile body would allow. She looked directly into the lens, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and strong and absolutely devastating. "My name is Eleanor Rose Morgan. I am 87 years old, and I am of sound mind. For the past 6 months, my daughter and her husband have been systematically removing my access to heat, food, medical care, and basic human dignity. They have told people I am dying naturally, but the truth is they are killing me by degrees. They are freezing me to death in my own home, and they are calling it mercy." She paused, looked directly at me, and continued, "Neglect doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just forgets your name. Sometimes it turns down the heat and walks away. Sometimes it takes a vacation while you die alone in the cold." When she finished recording, she took my hand and said, "Now we wait for justice to remember how to knock on the right door." We didn't have to wait long. My mother and stepfather returned 3 days later, sunburned and relaxed, and completely unprepared for what they were about to face. I heard their car in the driveway, heard their voices and laughter as they unloaded their luggage, heard my mother call out, "We're home," like nothing in the world had changed. They walked into that warm, well-lit house expecting to find everything exactly as they had left it. Instead, they found me sitting at the kitchen table with a laptop, a stack of documents, and a look on my face that could have frozen the Mediterranean. "Grace," my mother said, and the surprise in her voice was almost convincing. "What are you doing here? When did you get back?" "I got back just in time," I said, and my voice was so cold it made my own breath visible. "Just in time to find Grandma dying in a 41-degree room while you were working on your tan." The color drained from my mother's face so fast I thought she might faint. My stepfather stepped forward, already working on his defense, already crafting his lies. Now, Grace, you don't understand the situation. Your grandmother has been very sick, and the doctors said she needed rest. The doctors? I interrupted, and I could feel my control starting to crack. Which doctors? The ones whose appointments you canceled? The ones whose bills you refused to pay? The ones who don't exist because you've been letting her die without any medical care at all. I opened my laptop and turned it toward them. Grandma's face filled the screen, calm and clear and utterly damning. I pressed play. The silence that followed her statement was so complete it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. My mother's face went through this horrible progression of emotions: shock, denial, panic, and finally, a kind of desperate, ugly acceptance. She's confused, my mother whispered, but her voice had no conviction. She's old. She doesn't remember things correctly. I played the next video. Bank statements. Insurance changes. Medical records. The paper trail of their systematic cruelty laid out in black and white. Then I played the audio recording of their text messages. Their own words, their own casual discussions of letting an elderly woman freeze to death, played back to them in their own voices through text-to-speech software. My mother collapsed into a chair like her strings had been cut. My stepfather stood there opening and closing his mouth like a fish drowning in air. If mercy means leaving me to die, Grandma's voice continued from the laptop speakers, then hell must be full of kind hearts. That's when the quiet knock came at the front door. Not the aggressive pounding of law enforcement, not the dramatic crash of justice arriving, just a soft, respectful knock from Jake Morrison and his partner from Elder Care Services. I walked to the door with steady steps, my heart pounding, but my hands steady. This was what justice looked like in the real world, not thunder and lightning, but quiet voices and careful documentation, and people who cared enough to show up when it mattered. The officer stepped into our living room like he was entering a church, with respect and gravity and an understanding that something sacred had been broken here. He looked at my mother and stepfather with a kind of professional compassion that somehow made their guilt more obvious than any accusation could have. "Mrs. Patterson," he said to my mother, "we need to talk." What followed wasn't the dramatic confrontation you see in movies. There was no screaming, no finger-pointing, no big speeches about justice and vengeance. There was just this terrible, heavy silence as my mother finally told the truth. She broke down completely, sobbing into her hands like a child caught in a lie that had grown too big to contain. The words came pouring out of her in a stream of confession and self-pity and desperate attempts at justification. "I was so tired," she wept. "So tired of taking care of everyone, of never having any money, of never getting a break. David and I just wanted one week, without feeling like caregivers. We didn't mean for it to go this far. We thought she would just sleep more. We thought it would be peaceful." "You don't bury the living to rest the dead," I said quietly, and my voice cut through her sobs like a scalpel. The officer took notes, asked questions, documented everything with the methodical precision of someone who had seen this kind of horror before. But when it came time to discuss charges, Grandma made a request that surprised everyone. "I don't want them in jail," she said from her chair by the fireplace, wrapped in warm blankets and holding a cup of hot tea like it was a lifeline. "I want them to understand what they did. I want them to face it, to own it, to do better. But I don't want them in a cage. Cages don't teach empathy." So instead of pressing criminal charges, we filed reports with Adult Protective Services, with the State Insurance Commission, with every agency that needed to know what had happened here. My mother and stepfather would face consequences, financial restitution, mandatory counseling, supervised visits, a permanent flag on their records that would follow them wherever they went. But more importantly, they would have to live with the knowledge of what they had done. They would have to look at themselves in the mirror every morning and remember the day they decided an elderly woman's life was worth less than their vacation fund. The moral fallout was worse than any legal consequence could have been. My stepfather couldn't look at me or Grandma for weeks. He would come home from work and sit in his car in the driveway for 20 minutes, building up the courage to face us. When he finally did come inside, he moved through the house like a ghost haunting his own life. My mother aged 10 years in 10 days. The weight of what she had done settled on her shoulders like a physical burden, bending her spine and stealing the light from her eyes. She started volunteering at the local senior center, spending her weekends feeding people she didn't know because she couldn't bear to face the person she had nearly starved. "I don't know how to forgive myself," she told me one evening as we sat in Grandma's newly heated room, watching her sleep peacefully under warm blankets. "Then don't," I said. "Some things aren't meant to be forgiven. Some things are meant to be carried, to be remembered, to be the weight that keeps you grounded in what matters." But healing, I learned, doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like accountability. Sometimes it looks like two broken people learning to repair a heater together, working side by side in silence, because words aren't adequate for what needs to be rebuilt. My stepfather and I spent 3 days fixing that old radiator in Grandma's room. We didn't talk much, but there was something in the work itself, the careful adjustments, the patient testing, the shared goal of making sure warmth would always reach her, that felt like the beginning of something real. On the 3rd day, as we tested the heat for the final time and watched the temperature gauge climb to a steady 72 degrees, he said quietly, "I can't take back what I did, but I can make sure it never happens again." "That's a start," I said. And it was. Grandma's recovery was slower than her forgiveness. Her body had been through trauma that went beyond the physical cold. Her trust had been shattered, her sense of safety destroyed, her faith in family love tested to its breaking point. But she was strong in ways that surprised everyone, especially herself. 90 years on this earth teaches you that people are capable of terrible things, she told me one afternoon as we sat together watching the snow melt outside her warm window. But it also teaches you that people are capable of change. The terrible things don't cancel out the possibility of good. They just make the good more precious when it comes. She started physical therapy to regain the strength she had lost during those months of neglect. She started seeing a counselor to work through the trauma of being abandoned by her own family. She started rebuilding her life with a determination that put people half her age to shame. And slowly, impossibly, warmth began to return to our house. Not the artificial warmth of cranked-up heating and forced smiles, but the real warmth that comes from truth. The warmth of difficult conversations and honest apologies and people choosing to do better even when it's hard. The warmth of my mother reading to Grandma every evening, not because she had to but because she wanted to repair something that couldn't be fixed with words alone. The warmth of my stepfather learning to cook Grandma's favorite soup, studying online recipes and practicing until he got it right, because he needed to give something back to the woman he had nearly taken everything from. The warmth of family dinners where we didn't pretend everything was fine, but where we showed up anyway, together, imperfect, trying. 6 months later, Grandma called us all into the living room for what she called the last lesson I'm qualified to teach. She sat in her chair by the fireplace, wrapped in a quilt I had made for her, looking like the queen of our small, broken, healing kingdom. "Love," she said, looking at each of us in turn, "isn't about who stayed first. It's about who stays last. It's about who shows up when showing up is hard. It's about who chooses to see the human being inside the burden, who chooses warmth when cold would be easier." She paused, smiled that devastating smile that had been missing for too long, and continued, "We didn't rebuild the past. We can't. The past is written in ice now, and ice doesn't melt backward. But we built something new. Something colder in some ways, but real. Honest. And that's where love actually lives, not in the pretty lies we tell ourselves, but in the ugly truths we're brave enough to face together." As spring came and the last of the winter melted away, I found myself looking at our family with new eyes. We weren't the same people who had lived in this house a year ago. We were harder in some ways, scarred by truths that couldn't be unknown. But we were also more real, more present, more aware of how precious and fragile this thing called family actually is. My mother never fully recovered from the guilt of what she had done, and maybe that was appropriate. Some wounds are meant to stay tender, to serve as permanent reminders of lines that should never be crossed again. But she used that guilt as fuel for something better, channeling her remorse into action that helped other elderly people in our community. My stepfather became a different man, quieter, more thoughtful, more aware of the weight of his choices. He started volunteering with a local handyman service that helps senior citizens with home repairs, and I think working with his hands to fix other people's problems helped him process the things he had broken that couldn't be repaired. And me? I learned that coming home doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was. Sometimes coming home means building something entirely new from the wreckage of what you thought you knew. I learned that family isn't about blood or obligation or tradition. It's about choice. It's about choosing to stay when staying is hard, choosing to care when caring costs something, choosing to see the person inside the problem. I learned that justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like people facing themselves in the mirror and deciding to be better. Sometimes it looks like a warm room and a fixed heater and the quiet determination to never let anyone freeze again. Most importantly, I learned that love isn't a feeling, it's a decision. A daily decision to choose warmth over cold, presence over absence, truth over comfort. And that decision has to be made new every single day, especially on the days when it's hardest to make. Grandma lived another 2 years after that terrible winter, 2 years filled with warmth and laughter and the kind of deep conversations that only happen when people stop pretending everything is fine. She died peacefully in her sleep on a warm June morning, surrounded by family who had learned how to love her properly. At her funeral, the pastor talked about redemption and forgiveness and the mysterious ways that love can grow even in the darkest soil. But I think Grandma would have preferred the truth. That love is work, that families are choices, and that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the ugliest truths. After the service, my mother and I stood together in the cemetery, watching the dirt settle over the woman who had taught us both how to be human again. "Do you think she forgave us?" my mother asked, and her voice was small and broken and real. "I think she loved us," I said, which is bigger than forgiveness, which is harder and more real and more lasting. As we walked away from the grave, I felt something settle in my chest, not peace exactly, but acceptance. Acceptance that families are complicated, that love is messy, that redemption is possible but never simple. The house feels different now. Warmer, yes, but also heavier with the weight of truth. The radiators hum their steady song of warmth, and I sometimes catch myself listening to that sound like a prayer, like a promise that no one will ever be left to freeze again. If this story touched you, call the one you've ignored. Sometimes redemption starts with hello. Sometimes healing begins with a phone call you've been avoiding for months or years. Sometimes love is as simple as asking, "Are you warm enough?" Because here's what I learned in that frozen room, holding my grandmother while she shivered back to life. We're all just a few degrees away from losing each other. We're all just a few turned-down thermostats away from discovering who we really are when it matters most. And when that moment comes, when life strips away all the excuses and justifications and comfortable lies, the only question that matters is this: will you choose warmth or will you choose cold? I hope you choose warmth. I hope you choose to stay when staying is hard. I hope you choose to see the human being inside the burden, the soul inside the struggle, the love inside the loss. Because in the end, that's all any of us really have, the choice to warm each other or let each other freeze. And that choice, that simple, terrible, beautiful choice, is what makes us human. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for choosing warmth. Now go call someone you love and tell them they matter. Tell them while they can still hear you, while there's still time to turn up the heat, before winter comes again.